I can't stop thinking about what might happen to immigrants once Trump ascends to power. So I would like to give you some insights that I have learned from my genocide class about what that might look like in the United States. Genocides don't just happen overnight out of nowhere. There are building blocks to genocide. So these are ideology, context, and a precipitating event. In this case, you hear Trump talking about immigrants as vermin who are poisoning the blood of our country. This is quoting Hitler and his characterization of the Jews. This is very common when governments are building up to genocide, such as in the Rwandan case with the Hutus calling Tutsis cockroaches over and over and over again. It's dehumanization. There is always a context, real or imagined, of an existential threat to the dominant group, or to the group that is perpetuating genocide. So that can be prior genocides, but in this case, it would be probably the threat of an internal enemy, real or imagined. So in this case, the Trump administration is using immigrants as a scapegoat for all of the problems that are actually created by oligarchy and globalization and capitalism, and blaming immigrants as taking our jobs and destroying the fabric of our society, right? And that rhetoric will likely increase and become louder. And then we would need a precipitating event. So in the build-up to genocide, there are precursor events. These are often mass murders, massacres, that are not genocide outright, but they are done to desensitize the non-targeted population, as happened in the case of the Armenian genocide. The Hamidian massacres murdered up to 300,000 Armenians, and that's not considered part of the Armenian genocide. That is a precursor event that desensitized the Turkish population to them killing the Armenians in the Holocaust. This precursor event, one of them can be seen as Kristallnacht, which was a pogrom that was desensitizing the German population to the destruction of the Jewish community. Once there's been no significant pushback from communities on this, if, for example, from white Americans, if they do not push back, then they sort of have the go-ahead to go ahead, but there has to be a precipitating event. So it can be real or imagined. It can be similar to like a Reichstag fire, or it can be, in the case of Rwanda, like the plane going down with the president and a lot of government officials, Hutu government officials, which now scholars argue may have been shot down by Hutu extremists. But that's debated. But then that was the precipitating event that set off the tinderbox that had been building from the propaganda that had been spewed over the radio for so many years at that point. In the case of the Armenian genocide, it was the advent of World War I. It actually started the same day as the Battle of Gallipoli. Often the first group that is targeted of a population is the elites of that group. So this would be intellectuals, the highly educated, business leaders, people like that are wiped out or detained, or however they are dealt with. They are removed from their population, so their population is essentially left without their leaders. And remember, the whole time the government is saying that this group is an existential threat to the rest of the society. So after the precipitating event, people are often rounded up. So when you hear mass deportation, I want you to think of Jews in cattle cars, Armenians on death marches, these sorts of images, okay? That is what mass deportation is. And when the Germans wanted to do that with the Jews, they used the incredible European train system, the railroads. In the United States, we don't have that, so we would use the highway system. So immigrants would be rounded up onto big trucks, and they would be transported to the border. These trucks would not be made to support human life, and so a lot of them would die of heat stroke and suffocation and dehydration on the way. Once there, they may be concentrated into concentration camps, which already exist on the border but would be extended. And these camps already are horrific places that are disease-ridden and miserable. And we saw during the Trump administration previously, things like the child separation policy and migrants being mistreated in these camps was a huge deal. And those count in my book as precursor events that have already happened. I don't foresee like the Trump administration creating a system of gas chambers or that kind of thing. What I see are immigrants being forced on death marches into the desert. The desert is often very, very helpful in eliminating large groups of people. So in this case, I think it would be most comparable to the Armenian genocide, where Armenians, women and children primarily, were walked into the desert and allowed to die. However, they were not just like starved to death and dying of dehydration. The governments often use the plausible deniability of sicking paramilitary organizations and criminal elements onto these marginalized groups. So, for example, in the case of the Armenian genocide, the Turkish government released the most violent criminals from jails, and these formed shets, what are called shets, and these were then allowed to attack and rape and kill the Armenians who were vulnerable in these death marches. And Kurdish tribes were often also involved in attacking the Armenians and killing them. And then the government was able to say, like, oh, this was just, these criminal elements that they let loose, right? We already have militias on the border of American citizens who attack migrants and want to do this. And I think that those could be mobilized quite quickly under the supervision, explicit or not, of the Border Patrol. Some genocides target one particular part of a group. So, for example, gendercide, where men of military age primarily are targeted. Then there are root and branch genocides, where the entire community, from the youngest infant to the oldest elder, are targeted. And I believe that that is what we would see in the United States based off of the precursor events that I've already discussed in the child separation policy and like the way that we see Black and brown migrants being treated at the border already. I've seen a lot of creators talking about the economic ramifications of deporting millions of people who work jobs and pay taxes, but I think what people don't recognize, what I did not recognize, was that genocide is often quite profitable, and the people who are not targeted often gain immense wealth from the destruction of these communities. So I don't know how that would play out here, but that's something to keep in mind. One thing that brings me hope is that the United States is geographically an extremely large country, and theoretically there are lots of places to hide people. Unfortunately, we also face enormous technological barriers to that, including like heat sensing technology, surveillance capitalism, all the data that the government can access at the click of a button. So that would need to be someone else's area of expertise to explain how we get out of that. Let me know if you have questions in the comments.